You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. All right, we're going to spend some time talking about circumcision tonight, and looking at a few of the verses in Old Testament and New where both Moses and Paul are talking about it. Okay, don't think I need to go through the glossary again. We've covered that enough times. I don't think there's anything new in there this week. But let's start with verse 23 and 24. You who boast in the law dishonor God by breaking the law, for as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. So you who boast in the law, but break the law. What does it mean to boast in the law?
Bragging that you're a Torah keeper?
Yeah.
I think it's somebody that thinks that they're better than everybody else because they follow something and they don't do it. It's like anything else. You can say that that's my son, I'm a father, but then at home, you're not applying what it is to be a good father. And
yeah, and I think that goes well beyond just people who brag about knowing or keeping the law. It can be somebody who brags about having credentials. I've got a doctorate in ancient biblical studies, so why are you questioning me? Where's your degree? That kind of thing.
I was talking about boasting in the law. I'm thinking about, now I might be way out in left field, and it happens a lot when it comes to reading, when I understand scripture. When I think about boasting in Torah, when I think about that aspect of boasting in Torah, think about when Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 to talk about, thou shalt not commit thou shalt not murder. But if you think in your heart that you would want to do something ill effect to your neighbor, that's just as bad. Now, what I'm trying to say is that I don't want to be too long-winded here. I'm going to try to be as quick and concise as I can, because I know you want to finish Romans chapter 2. But when I look at the fact about, you could be a soldier, and yes, sergeant, 3 bags full, and I will make my bed, I will shine my shoes, but you'll have no respect when everything's over from the army. It's more about the attention to the heart. You could follow God's commandments, dot the I's and cross the T, but if your heart is not in it, you're not feeling the intensity and the intensity of the message and the amplification of the message. It's more than just murdering. It's more that you don't have that heart felt that you want to commit or wish ill to your enemy. That's what's more important. It's to intent. It's like in Matthew chapter 5 when Jesus is saying it's not just keeping commandments, but you want to go that barrier further to say that even in your heart you do not want to, in your will you do not want to do it. I don't want to murder. I haven't killed anyone, but I could hate my enemy. There's an intensity there. That's all I want to say.
Along those, the military analogy, when you're doing probably the same in the Marines, Carlos, but taking a test for promotion in the Air Force, mostly it's a multiple choice kind of thing, but there could be 5 answers and 3 of them could be correct, but they want the most correct answer. And they don't mean the most technically correct. They mean the one that is most in alignment with the philosophy of the Air Force. So you might know all the regulations, you might know every detail of every rule, but if you don't know the way that the Air Force thinks about the rules, then you're going to fail the test. And I think it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, it is. I think about when I went through and you do your boot camp, and at the end, once you graduate and everything else, they give you the insignia, right, of the Eagle Globe and Anchor, and they handed to you and everybody gets emotional and things like that. But after doing my time, which I did a long time there, you start noticing that that's just the beginning. Once you receive that, it's just the beginning, and you have to walk and talk the talk as well. And most of them, I would say, align to that and do that, and some of them don't. And it's kind of the same thing with the Word of God. It's easy, man, to read it. It's easy to talk about it, but walk in it's a whole different ball game to wake up every day and try to live it every day. In the military, when you wake up in the morning, everybody in the barracks is doing exactly the same thing. And the barracks has, 40, 50, bunk beds or whatever. So everybody's doing the same thing, right? The lights turn on, everybody's up at 4:30 or 4:30, and everybody's putting their boots on, for their blouse, everything's spit shine and everything. And the point I'm trying to make is that it's easy when all 40 people are doing the exact same thing at all times and everybody's policing each other and there's one barrack. But there's a difference for us, when we wake up in the morning, nobody's watching. There's not 40 other believers around you, but the majority around is unbelievers. Okay. And then you have to keep, there's more of a possibility of being influenced to do unrighteousness than to do righteousness, But then you have people that fake it, that wake up and do the uniform, look nice and tight and everything's in order. But once you get to your job or do what you have to do, they're the ones that are barking orders and not doing anything.
Excuse me. Go ahead, Timothy.
Jesus put that together in that analogy of the whitewashed tombs.
Yeah, in I think Carlos, you were saying something about how other people don't necessarily know what your rules are, so they might not know how to judge that from the outside. But when it comes to God's law, I mean, at least in America, almost everybody is familiar with some of God's law. I mean, they may have it out of context. They may not really understand what it means. But, as Paul pointed out in chapter 1, everybody knows instinctively the basics of God's law. So if we're out there preaching obedience and, saying that we're followers of Yeshua, we're Christians, or, whatever label we're putting on ourselves, if then we go out into the world and they all see us, obviously not following basic rules of morality. Now, of course, the world has some really screwed up ideas too. They think it's love to let people live fantasies. But, if they see us being dishonest, the basic things that everybody knows are wrong, that doesn't reflect badly on us so much as it reflects badly on God. They're not going to blame us. I mean, they'll call us names and things like that, but they're going to paint all of biblical faith in the same light based on what they see in you. And, I posted an article this morning on my blog, and it's not real deep. It's not real heavy stuff, but, it's just about being a part of your community and making sure that you're helping the people around you. And every time I post something like that, it's like I cringe when I hit that publish button, because I'm thinking I am always preaching to myself as much as to anybody else. And I don't think I measure up to the standards that I'm saying we're supposed to be measuring up to. And is everybody out there who's reading this, are they all going to be looking at me saying, what business does he have, publishing this article when I know he's not living up to this? I had those thoughts go through my head every time. And overall, I think that's a good thing. We need to be questioning ourselves so that we don't get in the situation like this verse is saying, bringing shame on the name of God among the Gentiles or the pagans or the woke crowd, or whatever label the current wicked crowd is applying to themselves, so that God's name isn't being blasphemed among them. So I think it's a good thing to be questioning yourself.
Yeah, it is. And to be honest with you, Jay, I struggle with the same thing when I put out a podcast, and tell the story and I say, hey, we have to be this way, that, and the other. And I think something in the podcast, you'll catch me saying, look, I'm not saying that I'm immune to this and that I don't struggle with these things. I still do struggle. There's times where, my anger, as just as it may appear to be, is not righteous anger, you know?
Hmm.
So I constantly have to, measure myself and make sure that, I'm discerning everything that I'm doing, because I pray this almost every day, is to not be a stumbling block to anyone. And it's a huge responsibility to take on. But at the same time, I always stressed out to listeners that, listen, when judgment day comes, it's not going to be me, you, and Yeshua there. It's going to be
Hmm.
just you. So you can't look back and blame, Jay or Carlos or Tim or Scott or anybody and saying, well, so and so, they were doing that, so I just figured that it was okay. Or, they told me that this, that, and the other, so I figured that was fine. Like, at the end
Hmm.
of the day, we have to take responsibility of our own salvation and our own actions and our own things. But yeah, on our side, I agree with you. It's good as well, and it's healthy for us to think about, are we doing enough? Am what
Hmm.
we want is straight in our path? And it makes me feel uncomfortable. But as I've thought, because I've actually, it's funny you brought this up, because I've actually been thinking about that the last few weeks or months or whatever, and I would rather feel that way than one day not feel that way. That I think that's when you need to be worried, is when you stop
Hmm.
thinking, oh, I'm high and mighty and I'm walking on water, and sure, not only am I preaching that, in other words, I'm pointing a finger and have 10 fingers pointed back at me and not realizing it.
Yeah, I mean, an easy out that I've seen from many people who choose not to be a Christian is to use the hypocrite word, and they'll point to, oh, I'm not going to go there because there's so many hypocrites that are in the church and whatnot. And the people that are being judged, yeah, you should be concerned about that, but you've got to realize that somebody making that statement, that's their issue.
Hmm.
You'll have to struggle with whether you feel you're following appropriately or not, but they have their stuff to work out too, and you can't let them project it upon you.
Yep, true. Tim, did you say that you had Matthew 23 ready?
Yep, she's booted up.
All right, would you go ahead and read verses 1 through 7?
Okay. Then Yeshua spoke to the crowds and to his taught ones, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moshe. Therefore, whatever they say to you to guard, guard, and do, but do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on men's shoulders, but with their finger they do not wish to move them. And they do all their works to be seen by men, and they make their tzitzi wide, or they make their tiflim wide, and and lengthen the tzitzi of their garments. For they love the best place at feasts and the best seats in the congregations and the greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi.
Yeah, and even though they know a lot of stuff, they are still bringing shame on God's name. They're supposed to be the teachers of Israel. And, you can teach people with your words, and that's important. But the people who are around you, who really know you, you're teaching them more by what you do than by what you say. All right, and I've got another verse on that one. Looking it up because I can't remember why I wrote it down. Oh yeah, somebody want to read Titus 1:16? Got a list of verses there in the chat. If anybody wants to pull those up ahead of time. All right,
I have
yeah,
it.
go ahead. Okay, who was that?
I was just saying I had it if people were still looking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
113?
1:16.
Sorry. Okay. They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. Wow.
Yeah, I saw
That
let's
was
see if I can
scathing.
find this, because I saw this thing about like a summary of all of Paul's letters today, and it was really spot on. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah, it was from somebody's talk. I don't know who this was. Can you see that? There's an outline of all of Paul's letters. Grace, I thank God for you. Hold fast to the gospel. For the love of everything holy, stop being stupid. Timothy says hi. I thought that was spot on. Yeah. So where was I? Oh yeah, Titus 1:16. They profess to know God, but they are detestable and disobedient and worthless for anything good. And yeah, he's talking about, if you go back a few verses, he's talking about people who are teaching Jewish tradition. It says, for this reason, reprove them severely so that they may be sound in faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. And so these are people who teach the doctrines of men as if they're the commandments of God, and who get bogged down in all kinds of Jewish mythology. And that's not to say that there's anything necessarily wrong with mythology that teaches lessons. Myths are usually just moral tales, or morality tales, I think is the right word, where for the most part, they're not meant to be understood as true. And the Talmud is full of these kinds of stories where some rabbi is saying, when Abraham was 12 years old, this thing happened. Of course, nobody knows what Abraham did when he was 12 years old. Nobody knows really if Abraham's father was an idol maker. These are all Jewish mythology. They're not biblical fact. But it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means don't get so caught up in those things, because there's so many more important things that we know are true. If God really wanted us to know Abraham's childhood, he probably would have put it in Genesis, in, whether I think it's, the book of Jubilees or Yasher, I can't remember which one actually talks about some of that stuff. But, Yasher is a medieval book. It's not even really ancient. And Jubilees didn't make it into the canonical scriptures for a reason, because most people, even in the first century, didn't really trust it. Jules, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I'm always, when I look at scriptures, even I know our manuscripts from Matthew to Revelation are in the Greek, and I look at that word, to know, it means to perceive, to notice, to discern, to discover. But when I think about the word knowing God, I think we need to branch out to the Hebraic perspective. Knowing God is more of an intimate relationship. It's more about. I think I've mentioned this to this telecast, this Zoom meetings before. I agree with Abraham Joshua Heschel, a wonderful student of the Word of God. He said, in the Greco-Roman and the Western culture, we always look at, when we want to understand God, we always use the noun and the adjective, nouns and pronouns and adjectives. Mm-hmm. But in the Hebrew, in a Hebraic perspective, we use the verb, what mm-hmm. God does. And there's an intimacy. That's my point I'm trying to make. There's an intimacy. When you think about Adam knew Eve, that's what we need to know. It's more of an intimate relationship. It's more about getting personal. We think about knowing, get the right data. But I think in the Hebrew, get the da'at. It's more important to understand in that manner, in that way. It's more of a relational. Even though mm-hmm. he's far above us, he's a power greater than us, but we need that level of intimacy. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, it's very true, because we can know, like we were talking about with the military's rules, we can know all of God's laws and, have all 613 commandments memorized, even though I think that count is essentially arbitrary. It's not a real count. We can have it all memorized and still not be keeping the commandments. We can believe we're doing it, think we have everything right because we don't flip a light switch on the Sabbath, or, whatever it is, whatever that bar that we think is the thing that divides those keeping the commandments from those not keeping the commandments. That's probably not it. There's not going to be a single hard line where you can say this is obedient and this is not obedient, no matter who's doing it. Now, there are things, way off here and way out here. Murder is always wrong. But then what is murder? It's not that killing is always wrong. It's murder that's wrong. But then we have to know God's heart in order to understand what murder is. So even in those things that seem clear, there's always shades of meaning that you're not going to get unless you really know God by having that relationship with him, like Abraham did, being the friend of God. All right, let's move on to the next one. Verse 25. For circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Paul isn't really talking about the circumcision itself. I mean, obviously your circumcision can't really become uncircumcision. So he's using this as a metaphor. Does somebody have Galatians 5:6 ready?
Okay, Galatians 5, chapter 5, verse 6.
Right.
Okay, for in Messiah Yeshua, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision amounts to anything, but faith working true love.
Yeah, Paul wrote both of those verses. He said circumcision nor uncircumcision amounts to nothing, but then he also said circumcision indeed is of value. So there's a tendency to take Paul in sound bites. And it's what I call soundbite theology. And you take one verse and you build a whole theology around it and ignore all the verses around it, ignore everything that Paul said everywhere else. But you'll never understand Paul by doing that. If you really want to understand what he's talking about, you have to take every word he says in the context of all of his other letters and then understand those in context of especially Torah. I mean, you need to know all of Tanakh and the Gospels and Acts, but really Paul is, almost all of his letters in some way are a commentary on Torah. So when he says circumcision is of value, and then in Galatians he says circumcision doesn't mean anything, what does he mean? How do you reconcile those? Jules, you got your hand up. Is that a comment on this, or is that a question?
Yeah,
Or...
yes. In case I lose it's very easy. I could lose late at night. I wake up 4 o'clock in the morning in my time schedule. So I want to make sure I don't forget to mention this, and I would tend to forget this. Whenever I see the word faith, the word pistis in the Greek, I think it's beneficial for us to understand. When we think about pistis, we could just say a mental aspect of faith or believing, just a mental aspect of believing. But I believe we should always translate, and it would be very helpful in the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation, wherever you see, and by many wonderful teachers, you see the word Greek in the Greek pistis. It's best to pronounce it faith/fullness, faithfulness. Think about fidelity. Think about that aspect. So it's very, to my understanding, it's not just a mental aspect that you think, but faithfulness. Even Abraham was faithful in one way, shape, or form, even from his as far as his father Terah. We need to understand they were sojourning to the promised land as much as they understood the promised land and their aspects. So I just want, when I think of the word pistis, I think we need to keep not just a mental aspect. When we think about the word pistis in Greek and faith, it should be faithfulness, fidelity. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Yeah, overall, I think Paul is talking about being faithful to the covenant, being faithful to the spirit of the law, where when he's talking about circumcision here, most of the time he's not talking just about the physical act of circumcision. He's using it as what's called a metonymy, which means it's one thing used to talk about a whole collection of things. So it's like if, trying to think of a good example, if I say I'm headed up to the Great White North, everybody knows what that means. It doesn't mean that I'm going up to the Arctic Circle, although it could. It means I'm going somewhere to Canada. In this case, Paul is saying, whenever he says circumcision, the first thing you should think of is rabbinic Judaism, or what passed as rabbinic Judaism in the first century. The whole rabbi system wasn't really solidified in the way that it is today, so it didn't quite look the same. But all the collection of traditions and all the extra rules, the 18 steps of conversion, and primarily this is the thing that he's talking about. When he says, if you go and get circumcised, Christ will mean nothing to you. Well, what he means is, if you go and you go through this process of conversion into Judaism, so that you can be a Jew and think that's going to save you, then why did Christ die for you? Because that's not what he said. And so when he says circumcision, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, means anything in Galatians 5:6, he's saying it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or you're not a Jew. What matters is that you are faithful to the covenant. You're faithful to God. And you can be circumcised and still not be of the circumcision. Now, you can't be uncircumcised and be of the circumcision, because that was kind of the gateway. I mean, you go through all these steps, and the last one was to be circumcised, at least as a man. And that made you a Jew in the eyes of Jews. And that's going to be a little more important here in a few verses.
So, Jay, circumcision was emblematic of joining the faith, if you will, of joining.
Mm-hmm.
It was a declaration. So if you make a declaration and you follow the tenets of what you're declaring, great. But if you make
Mm-hmm.
a declaration and you just do what you want, it's not applicable. So thus, Paul's statement in Galatians about it doesn't mean anything one way or the other. He's talking about, I believe, more or less your adherence to your beliefs as opposed to doing something emblematic. The emblematic action is not necessarily, sure, it's a good thing. I'm, I got some sort of, let's say I had a tattoo, if that were, and I'm now part of the club, so to speak. Great.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get your tattoo and you don't adhere to what the club's rules are, then what difference does that make?
Yeah. There are a lot of reasons that somebody will go through that process. And some people just want that tattoo. They want the bragging rights. They want to be able to wear the ring or whatever it is. A lot of politicians will become Freemasons even if they weren't before, because it opens doors for them. And many of them don't actually believe anything that the Freemasons teach. They really don't believe much of anything at all. But they do it because they know that there's this fraternal order, and they've got a relationship established with people in cities all over the world because they wear this ring, or they know the right handshake, or whatever the identifier is. And the same thing is true of being Jewish. There are a lot of people who convert to Judaism just because they want to be part of that network, or they admire the religious tradition and all the ritual. And this is especially prevalent in Hollywood. All kinds of Hollywood stars and starlets will convert to Judaism because it opens doors. It makes connections with producers and financiers and all kinds of people who will help them get roles and further their career, or because it's just the in thing to do in that crowd, not because they actually believe in anything that Judaism teaches. And so they go through all this process so they can wear the ring or get the tattoo, and it has no value to them at all eternally. God doesn't see them as any different than they were before they did all this. And that's what Paul is talking about when he's saying, if you go and get yourself circumcised, Christ means nothing to you. He doesn't mean that there's no value in physical circumcision, because God wouldn't command anybody to do things that there's no value in. Go ahead, Jules.
Yeah, just to very quickly say, when we think about the Hebraic perspective about understanding life, there is no dichotomy. There's not even a bifurcation of understanding this is spiritual and this is physical. To them, both can. Some teachers have said it much better than I can, and I'll try to do it justice as much as I can. I remember Dwight Pryor saying, think about the Word of God and think of the Hebraic perspective. It's very dialectical. The Word of God is very dialectical. It's two opposing ideas hold together in constant tension and moving forward. So A, yes, B, yes. But how do they relate? In the Greco-Roman, it's got to be A or B. It's got to be black or white. But in a Hebraic perspective, when you think about spiritual and what they were doing, there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance. And maybe that's where they got it wrong when you think about you think about the Talmud or the Mishnah or the Midrash or even the Targum for that matter, you don't get the balance correct. But I'm trying to say that the physical and the spiritual there's no dichotomy, and that's what's. I just want to add that because that's very important. I feel it's important to understand the scriptures.
Yeah, thank you. All right, there's something right here at the beginning of this verse. Circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. Does that mean, well, I think might want to hold that question for another verse. I think it's going to be better later on. Sorry about that. So it does say that circumcision is a good thing. It's not required for salvation. There are several stories in scripture that illustrate that. First off, it's not something that any of the apostles said. None of them said, in order to earn eternal salvation, you need to be circumcised. But there are some stories that illustrate this principle. For example, I think Paul also points this out, that Abraham was called and declared righteous before he was circumcised. The circumcision came later. The Hebrews were brought out of Egypt before they were circumcised. They were apparently circumcising their children when they were in Egypt, but there were a lot of them who were uncircumcised, and God didn't say anything about it when they left Egypt. It was only after they got to Sinai, and he's giving them rules for the next Passover, saying, okay, in future Passovers, you need to be circumcised if you're going to eat the Passover. But he didn't enforce that in the wilderness. They were all saved. I mean, they were all saved from Egypt, which is a metaphor of both sin and condemnation, slavery to sin. And it's real. I'm not saying it's not a real story. I'm just saying that real stories in scripture are also metaphor. It wasn't until they got into the promised land that all of those men in the wilderness were circumcised. But they crossed the Jordan, they crossed the Red Sea, then they crossed the wilderness where they were there in the camp with God. And then they crossed the Jordan into the promised land. And only then did God tell Joshua, okay, let's fix this problem. Everybody who hasn't been circumcised, circumcise them. And then they ate Passover. And the reason for that was both so that they would be fully in covenant, so that they would have all the signs of the covenant. They were already obedient and in covenant, but God wanted them to have the physical signs of it before they went into battle and conquered the land. And he had commanded that no man who is uncircumcised can eat the Passover. And he wanted them to eat Passover in the land. So this was a really special Passover. All the ones in the wilderness, you could say, were sort of like practice runs because they weren't growing crops. So they didn't have a barley offering to bring for the first fruits. There were a lot of things that they couldn't do in the wilderness. They probably didn't have any unleavened bread. So they couldn't eat unleavened bread for 7 days. All they had was manna. Anyways, I'm kind of getting off track there. But the point is that the circumcision wasn't the thing that rescued them from Egypt. It was their faith in following God.
Jay,
Can I say something?
go ahead. Sorry, Paul.
Oh, I was going to say, when you were just mentioning that, it made me think about how we're in the wilderness now, essentially, and we're practicing Passover. So it's a very similar process because one day we'll actually be able to be circumcised in the heart. God wants us to be if we follow and keep his commandments and love him and are transformed in that way. And then eventually we'll get to actually keep Passover in the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Jay, pre-Passover, Moses was afflicted, and circumcision was certainly an element that was involved in his affliction. So I believe Yahweh wanted Moses to have his sons reflect that circumcision when he returned to Egypt. But had his wife not done the circumcision, who knows if Moses would have survived. So, there's that element to look at too. I have no idea, the importance of it other than to acknowledge that it took place.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point to note. Circumcision gets a really bad rap in most Christian theology today. Like, why would you ever do this? I mean, if you get circumcised, you're just, throwing out the new covenant and trampling the blood of Yeshua, whatever it is that people say. They like, I know I'm mixing and matching verses together, but that's how those arguments go. But Paul clearly says that circumcision is of value if you obey the commandments. And when Moses was headed back to Egypt to free the Hebrews, and he had his family with him, God stopped him there and said, you didn't circumcise your sons like I said to. And, the text is a little ambiguous about who was going to get killed, but God was going to kill somebody. It was either Moses or the son who wasn't circumcised. Don't really know which one. Excuse me. Maybe both. And later, we know that Paul circumcised Timothy. It probably wasn't later. This was probably well after that point. So Paul circumcised Timothy because he was going to go and free some Hebrews, ironically enough. He was headed to, he'd picked up Timothy along the road through Asia, and he was going to take him on when they were going to go minister at some synagogues. And because he knew that the Jews there were going to be very conscious about anybody coming to teach them about the Messiah had better be Jewish. So he circumcised Timothy. If Paul literally meant that being circumcised would automatically put you under the condemnation of the law and ineligible for salvation, he never would have circumcised Timothy. That would be crazy. So there's another place where we have to strike a balance. Circumcision is a good thing if used properly. The law is a good thing if it's used properly. But, if you're doing it just to be in the club, then you're using it wrong and it doesn't count for anything. And that's where, at the end of this, it says your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. If you are circumcised just so you can call yourself a Jew and say, now you're one of the chosen people, bad news, you're not. You are not one of the chosen people. Cutting a piece of skin off doesn't get you in the club.
I just want to add, Jay, sorry to interrupt. I just want to, this is what we need to also remember. The reason I believe Timothy was circumcised because his mother was Jewish, but Titus, none of his parents were Hebraic or Jewish.
Yeah, and that would have mattered to the Jews. I think they were a little misguided about that matriarchal or matrilineal thing, but that's neither here nor there. All right. Anything else about this verse? Yeah, Timothy.
I had a quick question.
Hmm?
If Timothy's mother was Jewish, why wasn't Timothy circumcised on the 8th day or whatever?
Probably because his father was not Jewish.
His father's not Jewish.
Yeah, if
we don't really know anything about
his
father, do we?
No, we don't really know who his father was, but I mean, I'm sure there's some tradition out there somewhere, but I wouldn't put much stock in it. All we know is that his mother married a Greek, and that's pretty unkosher already. His father is going to be setting the law in his house, and he's violating some of his own customs, probably by marrying a Jewish woman. Who knows what the real dynamics there were, but they probably were Hellenistic Jews, pretty much assimilated into Greek culture already, and maybe it just wasn't that big of a deal to his mother. I don't know. I can only guess.
But she taught him the scriptures. That was kind of a big point Paul made.
Yeah, that's true. It was important to her to some extent, and maybe she really wanted him circumcised. All right, moving on to verse 26. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Pretty much exactly the opposite of what we just read. If you get circumcised, but you're not really keeping the law, then you might as well be uncircumcised. And here Paul reverses that and says, if you are uncircumcised, but you keep the law, then your uncircumcision is regarded as circumcision, or your status as a non-Jew is regarded as a Jew. But regarded by whom? Certainly not by Jews. Who do you think he's talking about? Well, he's got to be talking about God. I mean, who else matters? In this first part of the verse, if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, what law do you think he's talking about?
Torah?
Yeah. In the previous verse, in verse 25, for circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. Nobody thinks that this is talking about Roman law or Greek law or some the law of liberty of Christ, or some mystical thing that isn't clearly defined in Scripture. Everybody believes this is talking about the law of Moses. So in the very next verse, when Paul says, if an uncircumcised man keeps the precepts of the law, obviously he's talking about the same law. It wouldn't make any sense for him to change what law he's talking about in the middle here without some kind of indication. So how is it possible for an uncircumcised man to keep the precepts of the law? Does somebody have Genesis 17, 10 to 14 ready to go?
Okay. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall be my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant.
So any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person will be cut off from his people. He's broken my covenant. That seems to be pretty unambiguous. So what room is there for Paul to say, if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law? How is it possible for an uncircumcised man to keep the precepts of the law?
Well, I think, I guess context is part of it. These are new people coming into. They weren't born into it. So they weren't 8 days. They weren't born into it. So 8 days into it, they couldn't get circumcised. They're already adults by that point. I guess you can argue that it doesn't pertain to them in this sense. So it's more important for their hearts to be circumcised, which I know we'll read about that later, than actually be physically. But I think it goes back to what you were saying. It's about the clique and the club and all this other stuff, and we still see that. And that was one of the first epiphanies for mine, when I would reading the scriptures again from beginning to end and try to read it with different eyes, and not religious eyes, but relationship eyes. And Yeshua, when he came in, the people that he had beef with and bum heads with were the clique, were the religious leaders from that time. And Paul is still dealing with that now. He's still fighting it. So it's I wonder how much esoteric stuff was going on in that time, and how much push and pull that requires, or how much people were paying into doing that. It's all a scheme. In other words, it could have been. I know it probably doesn't go into details what else they were doing, but that's all it is clique. And it's in rituals, I don't think there's anything wrong with rituals as long as they're aligned with the Word of God, or there's nothing unrighteous in it. I think it's human nature to want to have this rite of passage from one thing to another. But again, it goes in your heart and what you're doing with it. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not about circumcised physically or not. This is just, it's ridiculous if you think about it in a way, right? I was like, so you're telling me I need to cut off this skin and then I'm good, right? If you think about it for a while, I mean, it's really is the most ridiculous thing. If you step back a little bit, you're like, man, that's so ridiculous. But you could argue the same thing, I guess, against Sabbath too, right? You're like, what are you telling me, man? That I got to be one day where I just not work, and God gonna think I'm a good dude because I don't, I don't work on the Sabbath or buy anything or sell anything. I said, ridiculous as that, that's what certain people would think too, So it's I get it why somebody, would want to, would think about it this way, but I think it's not just circumcision, it's just everything else, even the Sabbath. Just because you keep Sabbath, it doesn't make you holy. It doesn't make you
Mhm.
right at the end of the day. You know, if you're keeping Sabbath and then Sunday comes along and you go back to doing all kinds of things, what does it matter? I mean, you see, I see videos on YouTube all the time, and it's you know, Messianic Jews interviewing other, you know, Jews of the land, and they practice Shabbat and they practice Passover, but just as a tradition. They really are not in relationship with the Father,
Mhm.
with Hashem, as they call him, right? They don't have any real relationship. It's like, yeah, it's just a tradition, just it's something that I do because I do. And you know what? That's beautiful, man. I'm glad they're doing it instead of not doing it, because hopefully it'll dawn upon them. But at the end of the day, they just it's just superficial. There's nothing there. So it's definitely a matter of the heart, and the Father is, he sees everything. And yeah.
So if circumcision is a sign of covenant, as we just read in Genesis,
Mhm.
and you asked, how can you, without circumcision, still be acting covenantally? I think that covenant is the key word there, is if your attitude and your interaction with God is somehow attitudinally covenantal, I think you're bridging that gap somehow. But those are the two words that I would say. Circumcision, at least in Genesis, equaled covenant.
Mhm.
As to how you interpret it under Romans, that's to be determined. But I think the covenant is the key there.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'll come back to that in just a minute. Jules, you got something?
Yes, more of a question. When I think
Mhm.
about the passage in Genesis we read in chapter 17, it seems like if you bought maybe a slave, and it might not be someone from a Jewish background, it could be a foreigner. Is it saying that their children, if it's born in your household, has to be circumcised? Like I'm thinking about the commandment about Shabbat. Even if your slaves cannot work on that day, if you, am I understanding Genesis 17, the one we just read, incorrectly? Am I missing?
Yeah, it does mean that. If a Hebrew buys a slave, and in this case, Abraham was the only Hebrew. He's the only one who existed at this point. If Abraham buys a slave, that slave becomes part of the house of a Hebrew. And so he comes under those rules. Now, there are some rules that don't apply to him until that slave himself becomes a Hebrew. But as long as he's in that house, he's under the rules of the master of the house. So his children will be circumcised if they are in Abraham's house. And the slave has no say in that because he is owned by that master. Now, if that slave wants to become a Hebrew and worship the God of Abraham himself, well, then he comes under some new rules. If he becomes a Hebrew, meaning he puts his faith in the God of Abraham, well, now he's going to circumcise his own children, and he's going to be released in the 7th year, unless he decides that he wants to stay with his master. There's some reasons for that that's outside of our scope. But yeah, the servant who's born in your house, he's going to be circumcised and he's going to keep the Sabbath. All of your children who are born into your house, all of your sons, they are to be circumcised on the 8th day. In Genesis 17, what has happened is that God has introduced the circumcision as the sign of the covenant. So Abraham and Ishmael, they weren't circumcised yet. None of his servants were circumcised. Well, we don't know if any of them were or not. There were some groups of people back then who did practice circumcision for their own reasons. I don't know what those reasons are, but they had them, because you don't do that without a reason. But we can assume that Abraham and most of his servants were not circumcised. But when God gave this covenant, he said, at this point, all the males in your household will be circumcised. And I think specifically that's verse 14, I think that's who this is talking about. If there's any man here who refuses to undergo the circumcision, you got to get rid of him. He can't stay. I don't think that this is talking about all men in the future. That 8 days old, that's right in the middle of this. Where is that in verse? It was right in the middle of this passage. Oh yeah, verse 12. Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. So after that day, any male who's born in Abraham's house will be circumcised on the 8th day. Now, obviously, an 8-day-old doesn't have a lot of say in whether he's circumcised or not. So this thing about an uncircumcised male who's not circumcised, that person will be cut off because he's broken my covenant. That's not talking about an 8-day-old boy, because the 8-day-old boy doesn't have any choice in that. And, you know, when he hits day 9, you're not going to kick him out of the camp because he wasn't circumcised properly the day before. So I think that's only talking about adult men who are refusing to be circumcised in Abraham's household. And there are actually a couple of chiasms in this passage that make me believe that that 8-day-old thing is the key to understanding how that law doesn't apply to all men at all times. Let me bring that up. I know it's kind of a tangent, but oh, I closed my notes on Genesis. Let me find it again.
But we can't connect the dots. This Genesis that we read in Genesis we can't connect the dots. This has nothing to do with Timothy. This is not the same situation. Would I be correct?
Yeah, it's not exactly the same situation. Now, what should have happened is, in my opinion, Timothy was not a Jew. His mother was a Jew, and I don't think that really makes somebody a member of the nation of Judah. I think he is of the people of his father. And so his father's laws, if his father wanted to become a Jew, then yeah, Timothy should have been circumcised. Oh, Genesis came up on the wrong screen here. All right, I'm gonna have to zoom in on this so that you can see it. Okay. So there are two different chiasms here. In verse 10 and 11, there's a chiasm. My covenant between you and me, and a sign of the covenant, missing a C. Sign of the covenant between me and you, with every male circumcised, and you will be circumcised in the center. Now, if you're looking at this passage, that might help you, if you have your Bible open, looking at this passage for yourself might help you kind of put this in context. And then there's this statement at the beginning of verse 12, every 8-day-old male will be circumcised. And then it goes into another chiasm, every male circumcised forever, a covenant in your flesh forever, and in between, those born in your house or bought with money, and those born in your house and bought with money. So you got a parallelism in the middle of the chiasm. But this statement about the 8-day-old circumcision, that's kind of stuck in between the two chiasms, as if it's two chiasms in the point in the middle make, you know, another chiasm, sort of embedded literary structures. And that kind of underscores to me that the ones on the outside, this is my covenant between me and you, and all your males are going to be circumcised. And then on the other side, this is my covenant, and all your males are going to be circumcised, along with the rules about here's what we're going to do with all the males right now. And then in the middle, in the future, every male will be circumcised on the 8th day. Like, these are two different statements, but they're all about the same covenant. So here's what we're going to do today. Here's what we're doing in the future from now on. And then in the rest of Torah, I think in Exodus 12, which is another one I've got listed for the next verse, that talks about any foreigners who live among you, any sojourners who live among the people of Israel who want to eat the Passover, they have to be circumcised in order to eat the Passover. They don't have to be circumcised if they don't want to eat it. But if they're going to be part of Israel, then God wants them to eat the Passover, and then they need to be circumcised to do that. So in that sense, it is a good thing to be circumcised. If you have the opportunity to go to Jerusalem and eat a real Passover, then go get circumcised, because this honors God. But don't ever think that getting circumcised is what brings you into the covenant. It is a sign of the covenant, not the thing that actually makes you a covenant person. I don't know if any of that chiasm stuff made a lot of sense to you. I think I'd have to take some more time and diagram that out for that to be really apparent. But anyways, maybe we can do that another time. Anything else on verse 26 that we should talk about? Oh, actually, I wanted to bring up Matthew 3. Anybody have Matthew 3? Verses 7 to 10?
I could do that.
Okay.
Matthew chapter 3, verses 7 to 10. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming for his baptism, he said to them, "You offsprings of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore, produce fruit worthy of repentance." Verse 9. Don't think to yourselves, we have Abraham as for our father. For I tell you that God is able to raise up children to Abraham from these stones. Verse 10. Even now, the axe lies at the root of the tree. Therefore, every tree that doesn't produce good fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. I believe that's the last verse.
Yeah, thank you. So John was talking to Pharisees and Sadducees who were coming down to the Jordan River to be baptized. And he's there baptizing Israelites. And, this practice of baptism evolved out of the mikveh, or maybe the mikveh was commanded because they were already doing baptism. I don't really know which one is first, but it symbolizes a death and resurrection. Even in Torah, where there's a mikveh commanded, it's still symbolizing death and resurrection. You're dying to whatever was going on before, you're washing all that away, and you're being resurrected into a new life without that stuff that you've washed off. But John is saying, who warned you people to come down here? And they're like, well, we have the oracles of God, which is something we'll see here in a few verses. And we have Abraham as our father. So we are the chosen people. So we're coming down to be baptized because this is what Jewish people do. John is telling them that's not enough. It's not enough that you are a physical descendant of Abraham. You have to be a spiritual descendant of Abraham. And the circumcision, knowing the law, having the right parents, knowing what your genealogy is, all of these things can be good, positive things. But none of these things really make you a child of Abraham. What makes you a child of Abraham is being like Abraham, being a friend of God, having faith that expresses itself through obedience. Not just having obedience, that's not enough. It has to be obedience that stems from faith. And so John is pointing out that even though you are physical Jews, you might as well not be. It's not getting you anything. And when he says that God can raise up children of Abraham from these stones, maybe he was pointing at actual rocks, but there would have been non-Jews there too. I mean, lots of Gentiles would come to these things, even if they didn't really understand what the point was, because they could see that there was something really profound going on here, and they want to be part of it. He could have been pointing at Gentiles saying, even from these stones, these people that you don't even consider real living people. I mean, of course, they considered them people, but not on the same level. They didn't have the same level of spiritual life that a Jew did because he was a descendant of Abraham. And John is saying, no, God can raise these stones up into children of Abraham through their faith. People who have hearts of stones can be softened and turned into real children of Abraham, real Israelites, simply because they have faith and God declares it so. Jules.
I made sure I lowered my hand this time. Sorry about that, Jay.
Okay.
You guys look. Yeah, when I think in Hebrew, I know many scholars will say that in the first century they never spoke Hebrew. I'm really convinced that I think the NIV translation of the English translation is incorrect. I believe they could speak. I'm convinced that they could speak fluently Hebrew. That's why we have the evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls that they could speak Hebrew. But but look at the limerick: Ben, Aben, Ben, Aben. When you think about the word for son, Ben, Talmudid, you think about the word Ben for mean children, and then you think the word Aben, which means stone, rock. See the limerick? Now in the English, we don't get this. We don't get the limerick, children and stone. There's no limerick. So think what John the Baptist was doing is a play on Hebraic limericks. Just sounding. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, and John as a priest, and these Pharisees and Sadducees, they all would have spoken Hebrew. I mean, because they had to read it. When you go to the synagogue, at least in a synagogue in Judea, you weren't going to be reading from the Septuagint. Maybe in the Galilee or in other places, you'd be reading of, a Septuagint in your synagogue. But in Judea, especially at Jerusalem, you'd be reading from a Hebrew scroll. So they all would have known Hebrew from a very young age, especially somebody trained like that. Yeah, and it is really cool that there are little gems like that all over the Gospels that hint that they at least knew Hebrew. Whether they were speaking Aramaic or Hebrew or Greek, whatever language they were speaking, they understood the puns that were underlying what was really being said. Okay, anything else to talk about in this verse? Okay, let's go on. Verse 27. We already covered a lot of this, but he who is physically uncircumcised but keeps the law will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. We've already talked about how you can be physically uncircumcised and still keep the law. And in verse 26, he says, keeps the precepts of the law. So there's a little bit of wiggle room to say, well, he's talking about individual laws. You can keep a bunch of the laws, individual precepts, but maybe not all of the commandments. But in the next verse, he says you can keep the law without being circumcised. And somebody who is obedient to the commandments, God counts this as circumcision, which essentially means they are circumcised in the heart. And many people will say that if you're keeping the law, then you are automatically uncircumcised in the heart, and you've condemned yourself because you're trying to keep the law. But here Paul says that those who are physically uncircumcised and keep the law, those are the people who are righteous in God's eyes. And simply by their obedience to the commandments, they are condemning those people who claim to be obedient but are not.
This makes me think of the son who, the two different sons, one who said he would and didn't, then one who said he wouldn't and did.
Yeah, I don't remember where that passage is, but yeah, I do remember the story. Yeah, and Yeshua says, a man has two sons, and he tells them, he gives them some instructions, and one says, no, I'm not going to do that. But then later he does it. The other one says, oh, yes, Father, I'll do that. But then he never does it. Which one was righteous? Well, and everybody agrees. It's the one who actually did what his father commanded, who was righteous. All right, let's move on to verse 28. 28 and 29. For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, by spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. Now here's another pun, and you have to know Hebrew to know what the pun is. Do you know what this one is, Jules?
Not yet.
All right, well, let's go back to Genesis 29:35.
I'll read it quickly. Genesis 29, verse 35. She conceived again and bore a son. She said, this time I will praise Yahweh. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. Is that what you want me to read?
Yep, that's the one. And Yehuda, it means praised. So the word Jew, we haven't really defined Jew yet. We talked about it in the introduction weeks ago, but I think this is a good place to talk about that. There are multiple meanings for the word Jew. What we normally think of today is a Jew is somebody who keeps the religion of Judaism. Maybe they're descended from Judah, maybe not. They're people who practice Judaism. That was true in the first century too. People who kept the religion of the Jews were called Jews, or Yehudi, or however that was pronounced in Latin speakers and Greek speakers. But in Hebrew, it was a Yehudi. But that's not the only meaning of Jew. Just like the word Christian has a bunch of different meanings depending on context. A Jew could also be a descendant of Judah. Literally, somebody who is from the tribe of Judah is a Jew, the Yehudim. But the word kind of, like all words, it kind of evolves over time. And, when the kingdom of Israel was split into the northern kingdom, Israel or Ephraim, and the southern kingdom of Judah, people in the southern kingdom came to be known as Jews. So that by the time of the Babylonian dispersion, everybody who lived in the southern kingdom of Judah was called a Jew or Yehudi. And so when the southern kingdom was conquered by Babylon and taken off into captivity, wherever they were sent, they were called Jews. Didn't matter if they were from the tribe of Levi or Judah or Simeon or Benjamin, they were still called Jews. And there were many from the northern kingdom that were refugees that had come to live in the south when they were conquered by Assyria. So those people would have been called Jews too. Most of them probably remembered that they were from the tribe of Zebulun or, whatever tribe they were from. But after that Babylonian dispersion, over time, most of them forgot. But then there's all these people from the northern kingdom. And some of them stayed there and, mixed marriages with other people that the Assyrians brought in. They became the Samaritans. A huge number of them were scattered all over the known world at the time. Some of them fled to other countries during the invasion. Many of them were carted off into slavery by the Assyrians or resettled elsewhere. And the Assyrian Empire was pretty big at the time. So there were Israelites. These people were not called Jews. There were Israelites who were settled all over the Fertile Crescent, all over around the Caspian and Black Seas, in Egypt and Arabia. And over time, they scattered all over the place. I have a video series on YouTube. I'll post a link. When I upload this video, I'll post a link to that, and it's got some more information about this idea. Most of those people that were scattered from the northern kingdom were assimilated into the nations where they went. And they eventually forgot that they were from Israel. Not all of them did, some of them, but most of them did. Even today, the state of Israel has a program going out trying to find people who are descendants of those tribes. And, we talk about the lost tribes of Israel. The Orthodox view has been that those tribes were never lost, that they were all absorbed into the southern kingdom or into the Jews who were scattered by the Babylonians, and they're all called Jews today. Well, historically, that just doesn't work, and it doesn't fit some of the statements of Yeshua. In the time of Yeshua, he said that they had not been reunited yet, that there were tribes out there, they were descendants of Israel still out there in the nations to be returned. So who knows where those people are now? My opinion is that they were scattered all over the place so that God could plant theological seeds all over the world, so that then there would be these ideas embedded in pagan religions, so that when the truth came, when they heard about the Messiah, they would have something to relate it to. And they would say, oh yeah, we've got that idea in our religion too. And then it would make sense to them, and they would immediately recognize the truth of it, at least those people who were ready for it. I'm going off on another tangent here. I'm trying to find Jews, not Israelites. So they were descendants of the kingdom of Judah, whether they were still lived in Judea or they were scattered by Babylon or whatever. A resident of the Roman province of Judea in the first century would have been called a Jew. Even if you were an Edomite, to a Greek, you were still a Jew. I think in the 3rd century BC, one of the Maccabeans, I can't remember his name, I think it was John, he conquered Edom and forced them all to convert to Judaism. And so then later on, you get the Hasmonean dynasty and the Herods, who were actually native Edomites, and they were kings of Judah. They weren't really from the tribe of Judah. They weren't legitimate kings, but they were placed there by the Romans. But the Romans thought of them as Jews, and they practiced Judaism. And then pretty much anybody who lived in that province, who was descended from the people who used to live there, who practiced that religion, all of those people were called Jews. So it gets a little confusing. But Paul here is using a different definition. He's not saying that people who were descended from Judah are not really Jews. That's not his point. He's saying that a true Jew, somebody who lives up to the name of a Jew, is somebody who brings praise to God's name, somebody who glorifies God through his behavior primarily. This is a true Jew. So when he says a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart, or by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. And that's where the pun comes in. Yehudi means praised. And he says, he is praised of God. So the person who is praised of God, who honors God through faith and obedience, that's who Paul is talking about as a Jew. But through his other letters and through his travels, through the book of Acts, we see that he didn't really believe that people who were disobedient and who were not believing in the Messiah, he was never saying that they weren't Jews anymore. He was just using a metaphor based on the meaning of the word Jew. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's jump up to Revelation 2:9, because Paul was not the only one to use this metaphor. John uses it twice, or rather, I should say, Yeshua uses it twice in the 7 letters to the churches. Who wants to read Revelation 2:9? Go ahead, Tim. You're muted.
Revelation 2:9, I have been knowing your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the blasphemy by those who say they are Yehudim and are not, but are a congregation of Satan.
Yeah. So it's a little unclear whether John is talking about people who are claiming that they're Jews and really are not. But my suspicion, based on the context here, that he's talking about their behavior. I think it's much more likely that he's using the same metaphor that Paul is, by saying they say they're Jews, and maybe by physical descent, by DNA, they really are, but they're not behaving as Jews. They are not behaving in a way that is praiseworthy. And so Paul says that somebody who is a Jew outwardly, well, that's not enough. You need to be a Jew on the inside to really be a Jew, to be worthy of the name. And Yeshua, in this letter to the church of Smyrna, is saying these people who are blaspheming or slandering, the Greek word is ambiguous. It's not really clear whether they are slandering the people or blaspheming the people in Smyrna, the believers, or they're blaspheming God. It's not really sure. But either way, they are bringing shame on the name of God. They're bringing dishonor on him. And to go back a few verses earlier, they are causing the pagans to blaspheme the name of God by their behavior, by their unpraiseworthy behavior. So people who say that this is evidence that the Jews are fake and they're all descended from people who converted to Judaism, whether it was the Khazarians or whoever. And obviously there have been a lot of people who have converted from other religions into Judaism, and they're not physically descended from Judah. But some people will say everybody who calls themselves a Jew today is fake, or some of them will even say that they're demon-human hybrids, Nephilim or whatever. That's not what these verses are about. These verses are about people's hearts and their behavior. You can be a Jew through circumcision and a Jew through common descent from Judah, which is the purest form of the purest meaning of the word Jew. But if you are not bringing praise to God and you are not living a life that is praiseworthy by God, you're not really a Jew on the inside. Any other comments or questions about that verse?
Now, on a lighter note, I do find it just incredible that there's been this faith and this group of people that have been around for thousands of years that have carried the same language, the same writings, the same faith, and how all of this has been transformed. How the world has been transformed just by this. I agree with what you said about the 10 tribes scattered out in the 4 corners of the earth, and those things, they assimilated to some of the cultures that were around them, but the cultures also grasp to some of their stuff as well, because now at least for the last, I don't know, 100, 200 years, you have seen a world that in unison predominantly believes the same things.
Mm-hmm.
And that all comes from the law of God, from the Torah in some way, shape, or another. The reason that I think we've seen this incredible boom in all countries coming together, yes, we've had wars and we've had our differences and things like that, but you see it everywhere. You know, I said that where my family's from, you know, you see it there as well, like Judaism, in other words. You see that there. You see how it has impacted governments and culture and everything. And so they may not, it may be this is just repetitive, man. They've always been, the Jews are, and when I mean by the Jews, I mean like the culture itself and faith. They've always been stiff-necked, but God's always used them somehow for His honor and glory, and we'll reap the benefits of that regardless. And I think at some point, right, it was our job as Gentiles to make them jealous, because He sees our faithfulness, and it happens. You know, there's Jews now that, especially, you know, those of us who keep what they think are traditions, but for us are of, you know, the feast and Shabbat and eating clean and all this other stuff, and you know, if anything, that's just sparked up some interest in them again of who their God is. You know, so wow, my God is real. He's just not a religion where we just go by the motions of everything else, but here's these people that have nothing to do, completely separate from our God and our culture and our faith, but they're worshiping the exact same God and we are. I just find that just amazing. And that's just one other thing for us to believe that there was the existence of Yeshua. Who else could have came to this earth and just completely changed everything and turned everything upside down and got this most of the world to be monotheistic, you know?
Yeah. There's been a lot of corruption, but there is a lot of continuity.
Right.
It is
That's
just
my word.
amazing.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, pagan societies have some of that same continuity. That, you know, if you look at some of the pagan mythology of India and compare it to pagan mythology of the Vikings, there are some remarkable similarities.
Absolutely.
And then look at stuff from Central America and South America. Now the names are very different, and the art may be different, but the ideas are the same. They've got the same god of this and the god of that, and some of the stories are even the same. It's really amazing, and it shows that there is either something written in our DNA that makes us look for the same things in the supernatural, or there really is a common root to all these stories. And more than likely, it's both.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, every culture has the story of the flood. I mean, the Chinese culture has a story of the flood, and other cultures have had the same story of the flood. So that ought to say something, you know. But the flood, for example, and I don't know this exactly, but I don't think any other culture really like explains it in that detail, or we have known it as it is, as we have known it from the Torah, you know. Like so everybody knows for the most part who Yeshua is, but a lot of us, I can't even name you one other God from any other culture. I couldn't even do it.
Well, pick a word, and there's probably a God out there who goes by that name.
Yep.
Friday.
Yes. Days of the week, all named after pagan gods. And most of our months.
Yeah.
Saturday.
Yep. Yeah, Jules.
Yeah, I just want to mention, like, we think about, and this is both you and me, Jay, we're trying to do our best, our innermost and outermost, to be really involved on the Twitter or the X app universe, and to try to text, and we try to bring an understanding. We need to push this understanding. When we think in most Christian Twitter spaces, they see a bifurcation. They see a dichotomy between the Mosaic law, and I think we should always try our best to mention that our relationship, and this is probably where we're going here with what we were learning tonight, our relationship to the Mosaic law, our relationship to it, us in the 21st century, has to be different. We need to put the cards on the table and says our relationship to the Mosaic law, it has to be different than it was in the time period of Moses. But on the other hand, this is where we need, and this is what we're learning tonight, our attitude to the Mosaic law. Our attitude to the Mosaic law must be the same or even stronger than it was Moses. So our relationship is different with the Mosaic law. When you think about circumcision, or even way back to a little bit after Abraham, our relationship is different, but our attitude, we need to keep a stronger attitude to the covenant people, and where, when, and why they were keeping rules and regulation. Our attitude stinks. We need to improve it.
Oh yeah, it does. We have
Yeah,
fallen a
we can
long
get
way.
awfully flippant about things that we don't find important in the scriptures. Say, well, I won't do that this time, or I'll maybe go buy some milk, or I'll not love my neighbor, or is
Yeah,
bacon
I
gonna
think-
kill me, really? Like
Yeah,
that.
it is important to realize that, it's not the minutia of the law that saves us, or anything in the law that gives us eternal life, but they're important. God never would have given these commandments if they didn't matter. And if you're not progressing, if you're not becoming more obedient over time, then I don't see how you can say you're really a disciple of Yeshua. Hey, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to make a comment on the the Jewish, like what you said about some people believe this, some people believe that. I do find it very interesting where you have a society, Hollywood, even in the field that I work in, there's a lot of prominent Jewish people that are in that field, in that industry. And even going back to like the Frankfurt schools in Germany and how that was moved to the United States. And that's when the sexual revolution started happening. And that's when there was a big transition of the socialism mentality and that like all that was birthed from that Frankfurt school. And it's not to just questions that arise in my mind because I'm not very familiar with Hebrew history. Is there a big difference between the Jewish people today, or the ones that proclaim they're Jewish, and compared to the Hebrews of old? I'm not very familiar with the history, and I just want to know if you had
It
any.
depends on what you mean by difference. I mean, obviously, the religion has evolved over the centuries. The core ideas are the same, and a lot of the ritual ceremony goes back thousands of years. And but then there's been a lot of intermarriage, a lot of assimilation into pagan cultures and from pagan cultures. A lot has changed over the years. There have been genetic studies that show common DNA between all of the various Jewish populations around the world. Whether it's Ashkenazi or Jews in Africa or India, all of these scattered places shows some common lineage. So they are related to each other, but there's a lot of differences too, which means there's been a lot of intermarriage over the centuries. And, God counts nations differently than we do. He counts by fathers, but then he also recognizes a process of adoption where you can be a sojourner in a nation and then become part of that nation. Just depends on, in Israel, the real dividing line between a sojourner and a native is inheritance in the land. But, the sojourner who lives in Israel is an Israelite in everything except that inheritance. So they become an Israelite the longer they live there. So just because somebody wasn't necessarily born to a native Israelite father doesn't mean they can't be an Israelite. So Yeah, that's a hard question to answer. Really just depends on what you mean by it, I guess.
No, that was good feedback. It's just something that confuses me because the verse that we read in Revelation about the him saying that they're not really Jewish.
Hmm.
Um, it's just interesting, especially with all the mixing that's been going on. The lineage, it's we're before countries used to be very special and distinct. Now
Hmm.
there's a lot of mixing where we're losing the identity of a lot of the different countries and we're just becoming one. We're like the Tower of Babel, and even language barriers are being like most people do speak the same language because you can speak different languages, but it's just an interesting study that I would like to do more of and understanding history in that
Yeah.
perspective. So, but I
Yeah,
appreciate your answer. Thank
there's a YouTube channel that I'll recommend. I don't remember the name right now, but I'll find it and I'll put that in the post in Common Sense Bible Study when I upload this recording. I'll put that in there too, because I mean, I don't think that they're Christians or believers of any kind, but they have done a lot of research about, the movement of nations and where did this people come from? Like, where did they migrate from? How did their language come to be this way? And it's some really interesting stuff. So I'll post a link to that later. Jules, we got time for one last comment.
Yeah, and I'll honor that, and I'll be quick as I can. I just want to piggyback on Kevin's question. When I've been learning as much as I can been learning in the past 10 plus years, the Hebraic movement has been a blessing to me.
Mhm.
Like Dwight Pryor and David Flusser and Abraham Joshua Heschel and David Biven and Roy Blizzard. There's so many people out there trying to understand the first century understanding of Judaism. This is what's very important. The Orthodox Judaism of today is related to, but it's not the same. It's related to
Mhm.
what happened in the first century prior. We need to understand it's just like us today. We have many denominations and non-denominational churches that say, I love Jesus, right?
Mhm.
Now, think in the time of Jesus and first century and prior, there were the Essenes. That's another thing we never hear about in our gospels is the Chesedines, the sin-fearers. The Chesedines were also known as fearers. They also believed they could talk to Elijah. And we think about the Mount of Transfiguration, and also they believed they could heal and heal people from sickness and could raise people from the dead, and they could
Mhm.
heal people from. So what I'm trying to say, in the time of Jesus, there were many Judaisms. That's my point I'm trying to make. There were many Judaism. So that's
Yeah.
something important about understanding the first century. That's all I want to leave with to answer Kevin's question, because when we think about Judaism, we look at a synagogue, and today in 2023, we go downtown street somewhere, and that's Judaism that was in the first century. No, it was not the same. It's related to it. It's not the same Judaism. We need to
Mhm.
remember.
Yeah, there were what we would call denominations of Judaism in the first century, and there are now. A lot of Jews will say there's no such thing as denominations in Judaism, but that's not true. There really are. They may not be as strongly organized as Christian denominations, but they're still denominations. All right, we need to pack this up. We did finish chapter 2, so next time we'll start on chapter 3.